It was a hot and humid night, as if the air around was too heavy to breathe. The place was simple, maybe even modest from the outside. A poker table in a forgotten bar, where few could imagine that a regular game could turn into something extraordinary. But there, amidst the smoke and chips, a simple man was about to change the course of his life. The car washer, with his calloused hands and a life marked by long work shifts, didn't seem to fit in with that circle of experienced players. He was the outsider, the rookie who, for some reason, had dared to step into that unknown world. His eyes were fixed on the table, but his mind was beyond the cards, beyond the bets. He wasn't just there to win, he was there to earn something that seemed out of his reach: respect. The table was surrounded by veteran players, all confident in their skills, each with their own stories of success and past victories. But the car washer was after something more. He didn't see poker as just luck or skill with cards. To him, it was a chance to change his life, a chance that had more to do with observing and understanding the people around him than the game itself. No one there knew that. To the other players, he was just an amateur, someone who didn't deserve even a serious glance. They laughed at him, exchanged knowing, mocking smiles, not realizing that they were about to face a great lesson. As he observed, the high stakes and the growing tension around the table seemed to have no effect on him. Unlike his opponents, who were already weighed down by experience and expectations, he had something they didn't: the freedom not to care. He didn't carry the burden of pressure, the responsibility to always win. That, perhaps, was the advantage he needed. The car washer knew the secret of poker wasn't just in the cards, but in the people around him. He knew the game went beyond what was visible, and unlike the others, he wasn't there to prove he was the best poker player. He was there to learn something far more valuable, something they wouldn't realize until it was too late. Poker is a game of people, and he knew human psychology better than anyone. Every glance, every movement at the table, he was soaking it all in. His goal wasn't to be the hero of the night, but maybe just a surprise. Something that would make the others rethink their certainties and understand that what mattered most, there wasn't the cards, but how you played with the people. The tension in the air grew. The chips spinning on the table were like a reflection of the emotions of those experienced players. But the car washer was calm, just playing the cards he had, and playing much more the emotions of those around him. It was in the unexpected that he felt the big change was about to happen. The atmosphere was tense, but the car washer seemed, in some way, oblivious to the whirlwind of laughter and condescending glances swirling around him. The poker table, lit only by a yellowed lamp that gave the place a shadowy tone, was a battlefield for those who had made gambling an art, almost a science. But for the car washer, all of this seemed like just another card game. He didn't have the shine or experience of the other players, but he wasn't naive either. He knew that to them, he was just an amateur, a pawn. However, what stood out the most was the contempt he felt emanating from each one of the players. It was subtle but sharp, disguised in jokes veiled as good-natured. They laughed, but it wasn't genuine joy. It was mockery. The car washer's figure, with his focused expression and the look of someone who wasn't there to fool around, was the joke of the night. As the game went on, one of the players, who seemed to be the most experienced of them all, spoke in a loud voice, so everyone could hear, "I bet if you won anything here, it'd be a miracle." This kind of comment didn't go unnoticed. The car washer, however, remained impassive. His face revealed no emotion, but inside he was far from indifferent. What bothered him more wasn't the comments themselves, but how he was seen, how others perceived him. As insignificant, someone who didn't belong there, at the table where the game and the manipulation of the mind intertwined. He knew that in their eyes, he was just a background player, another face to be discarded by the end of the night. The problem, though, was that, at some point, the veteran's own confidence would start to waver. They didn't know it, but they were slowly losing the advantage they thought they had. The car washer knew how to deal with pressure, how to control his own feelings so they wouldn't show in his eyes. Unlike the other players whose hearts raced to the frenetic pace of the high bets, the car washer breathed calmly, almost meditatively. He watched, studied, and most importantly, he didn't care about the contempt he received. Contrary to what many thought, he knew their feelings were his fuel. It was in their disdain that he found his strength. Deep down, he thanked them. They thought that by belittling him, they were making him weaker, but he knew it was a double-edged sword. The more they despised him, the stronger he became, because with each joke and mocking glance, he became more focused. He was preparing for the big turnaround. And something deeper was happening. The disdain from the other players wasn't just a reaction to his presence there. It was a projection of their own insecurities that the veterans carried. The car washer realized this early on. He wasn't just another player. He was a reflection of the weaknesses the others tried to hide. For the veterans, the poker table wasn't just a competition of skills. It was a battlefield where egos took precedence over the game. They wanted to show power, to prove they were in control, that their strategies were infallible. The car washer, on the other hand, was there to learn. While the others were concerned with being better than each other, he was just trying to understand the game at its purest essence, a game of people. To him, poker was more about the emotions of the people than the cards being dealt. He knew that by reading others, he would gain far more than if he tried to match their skills. The game continued, and with it, the jokes. At one point, the players, clearly annoyed, turned to the car washer and asked with a mocking smile, "What are you even doing here, really? Don't you think this world is only for those with experience? You might wash cars well, but this game isn't for amateur." The comment was followed by muffled laughs from the other players, who felt confident they were in control of the situation. The car washer, for a moment, looked at the table as if pondering what to say. But instead of responding with words, he simply leaned back in his chair and with a subtle smile said, "You'll see." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one could understand. It was as if he were warning them without alerting them, as if the future was already set, and he was just waiting for the right moment to act. They laughed, of course. They couldn't imagine that man, in his car washer uniform with his calloused hands, was more than what he seemed. That night was far from just a poker game. For the car washer, it was about much more than the chips on the table. It was about his own identity, his dignity. He wasn't there to prove anything to the others, but to prove to himself that appearances can be deceiving. He knew that the contempt, in his case, wasn't just a reaction to what he represented, but a consequence of what the others were trying to hide from themselves. That's why he stood firm. It wasn't some simple disdain that would shake him. He knew that the real game wasn't against the other players, but against the perception they had of him. Meanwhile, the chips spun, and he, with his keen eyes and strategic mind, waited for the right moment to do what everyone thought was impossible. Surprise. When the car washer first sat at the table, the expectations of the other players were clear. He was an easy target. They laughed among themselves, exchanged jokes, and didn't care one bit about the man who, apparently, was there more by chance than by his own will. The only thing he had going for him was his impassive expression, as if he were there to fulfill a mission, a challenge he didn't fully understand yet, but somehow knew he would have to face. The cards were dealt, and the game began. For the veterans, poker was more than just a game. It was an art, a philosophy, a place where mind control and reading people were as crucial as the hand of cards itself. But the car washer didn't possess this wisdom. Unlike the others, he wasn't trapped by any expectations. And this, unknowingly, was about to become his greatest advantage. The first moves were just a series of observations. He didn't rush, nor did he feel pressured to follow the frenetic pace of the others. While the experienced players alternated between high bets and daring challenges, the car washer remained silent, simply watching. He could feel the weight of disdain building around him, but his mind was free from it. He knew no one believed in him. The idea of winning was something distant to the others, something seemingly unattainable, and at the same time, it was exactly what he needed to win. They couldn't see what he was seeing. He didn't need the best cards, he just needed the best mind. Poker, in the end, wasn't about the hands, but about controlling the minds of others. He was there for that, to learn about the others, study their reactions, and use that knowledge to his advantage. When he made his first big move, everything changed. It was a simple move, but with a level of subtlety the others didn't expect. Hand after hand, he found himself winning. And it wasn't just luck. He was starting to understand the game at its deepest level. Every bet, every expression of the other players, every movement on the table were like visible signs, like clues in a race where everyone was blind. But he wasn't. He began to realize that poker wasn't about having the best hand. The real secret was understanding the others, reading their expressions, noticing their movements. The cards were just an excuse, a facade. What mattered there was the psychology, the ability to control emotions and manipulate the minds of the other players. The car washer was no longer the amateur. He was becoming a real threat. As the plays continued, the veterans started to wonder, what's he doing? There was something strange in the air. The victories kept piling up, and the table, which had once been full of laughter and cynical smiles, was now becoming a field of tension. Conversation started to fade, and all attention was focused on the game. Each new hand the car washer won was another proof that he wasn't a rookie, but rather someone with a skill no one could identify. The experienced players, so used to dominating the table, began to realize they were losing to someone who, theoretically, should have been unprepared. But the strangest part was that the more they tried to figure out his strategy, the more it seemed to slip beyond their control. The car washer wasn't just playing cards. He was playing the mental game. Every move was carefully planned, every bet a calculated play. He wasn't there to win simply. He was there to unsettle and confuse. And that's exactly what was happening. The first big turning point came when he won the first hand outright, giving no chance to the other players. The bet was high, and everyone was eager to see who would come out on top. When the cards were turned over and the car washer revealed his winning hand, a heavy silence fell over the table. The chips he had in front of him, once nearly non-existent, now formed a respectable pile. He didn't celebrate, didn't do anything except for a calm look, as if it was something entirely expected. But to the others, the feeling was one of shock. They hadn't seen it coming. They didn't know what had happened, but they were beginning to understand that this amateur wasn't who he appeared to be. To them, the game had just taken on a new dimension. The car washer wasn't there to mess around. He was, perhaps, unknowingly, challenging the very essence of the game. The other players, so confident and full of themselves, were now on the defensive. The confidence that once dominated the table had given way to doubt. They were starting to realize that maybe their game wasn't as foolproof as they thought. The car washer wasn't a poker master, but he had achieved something far more valuable than that. He had conquered the minds of the other players. Somehow, he had used the expectations they had of him to his advantage. He knew no one expected anything from him, and that, in itself, became a powerful weapon. He knew the others were more concerned with the image they had of themselves than with the reality of the situation. They were playing with the cards, but he was playing with the people. Every movement from the other players, every hesitation, every sigh, was absorbed by him and used to his benefit. He was starting to realize more and more that poker wasn't just about who played the best, but who could control the opponent's mind. He was, in fact, winning the game before the cards were even turned over. And that was something the others still didn't understand. As the game continued, the car washer grew more and more confident, more precise in his moves. The victories began to pile up, and the respect that had once been non-existent started to emerge, but now with a hint of envy. It wasn't just a simple win, it was a turnaround. Every new pot he won was another lesson for the veterans. The car washer wasn't there to prove himself, but the others, no matter how hard they tried, were losing more than just the game. They were losing the mental battle. The car washer's victories started to be seen as more than simple luck. They were recognized as a rare and unexpected skill, something that couldn't be explained by mere experience. It was something deeper, something more psychological. And when he won the second big hand, the final piece of the puzzle was in place. He wasn't a rookie, he was a master at reading people's emotions. That's what made him unbeatable. That's what the others couldn't understand. The car washer wasn't there to just be another face at the table. He was there to teach a lesson, and he knew that sooner or later, everyone would have to learn it. The game continued, but the dynamic had completely changed. What had once been a contest of experience was now a mental war. The car washer had begun to dominate the other players, not with his hands of cards, but with his unusual ability to manipulate the mind. The victories were far from coincidence. They were the result of a well-calculated psychological game, and the veterans now knew the game was no longer in the cards, it was in their heads. The game, which had started with a simple set of cards and bets, had now turned into a mental, psychological, and emotional showdown. With each new hand played, the car washer became an increasingly dangerous piece on the board, and the atmosphere in the room grew ever more tense. What was supposed to be a trivial poker game, something the veterans saw themselves as masters of, now seemed like something much larger and more complex. The chips in front of the car washer grew gradually, while the veterans began to feel the weight of their own bets. What had once seemed like a simple matter of who had the best cards was now a battle in the minds of each player. The mind of the car washer, though not trained at poker tables, seemed sharp, perhaps sharper than any other present. In the early moments, the veterans had laughed at him. After all, who was he, if not a simple car washer? The idea that someone in his profession could compete in a game like poker was ridiculous. However, as time passed and he remained calm, balanced, and consistent, the discomfort among the more experienced players became increasingly evident. It was no longer about who had the highest cards, but about who had the emotional control. With each new victory, The car washer's confidence grew, while the others began to crumble. They were losing and couldn't understand why. Some started to try changing their approach, but it was as if the pressure was on them, like a shadow they couldn't shake. For the veterans, poker had always been about control. They had been trained in all the nuances of the game, reading the cards, manipulating chips, the art of bluffing and deceiving. But no one there knew what was happening in the car washer's mind. He wasn't playing with the cards. He was playing with them. What he knew, that the others didn't realize, was that poker wasn't just about the cards or the bets. Poker is about observing, studying, understanding the reactions of the people around the table. The other players were so focused on their own hands and bets that they weren't seeing what was really happening. The car washer was reading them. He was observing their reactions, their emotions, their micro-expressions. He knew that no one there was playing just to win. They were all playing to avoid defeat, to protect their egos and skills. He used that to his advantage. As the game progressed, the other players began to notice something even more unsettling. The car washer didn't let victories or defeats affect him. He seemed unshakable. For the other players, that was harder to swallow than losing. How could someone be so calm at a poker table filled with tension and high stakes? Their confidence was being gradually eroded. The car washer, with his serene calm, seemed to be the only one truly in control. At any moment, he could defeat them. Again, not with cards, but with his mind. This made the veterans' reactions increasingly predictable. The doubtful looks, the nervous hands, the wrong or hesitant bets. None of it escaped his eyes. He was ahead of them, not because of the cards, but because he could see beyond what they were offering. One of the most intriguing discoveries for the veterans was the way the car washer reacted to their provocations. On several occasions, one of the more experienced players tried to ridicule him, trying to provoke him into making a mistake. However, the car washer didn't fall for it. He maintained his calm, unwavering posture. He knew the biggest trick in poker was not revealing your emotions. Every time a player tried to distract him or force him to make an error, he stayed focused. This was something that baffled his opponents even more. To them, poker was a game of strategy and control, but also of emotion. The one who kept their cool stood out. But what the car washer was doing wasn't just that. He was controlling his emotions and the emotions of others, more than anyone had ever imagined possible. The veterans began to wonder what else he knew. How could a simple car washer be doing so well in a game that required so much cunning and control? They started to investigate more about him. There was something striking in his presence, something they hadn't considered until that moment. The car washer seemed to understand people. He wasn't just winning hands, he was manipulating the game. He knew the secret was in observing what others didn't see, the small reactions and the subtle shifts in behavior. Poker wasn't just about understanding the cards. It was about understanding people. He didn't need to be the best poker player. He just needed to be the best observer. And that made him more dangerous than any veteran at the table. As time passed, the car washer's victories began to defy expectations. What was supposed to be a simple game among friends and fellow gamblers was now becoming a battle of egos. The car washer was, unknowingly, gaining something far more valuable than chips. He was gaining respect. The mere fact that he was still there, still playing and winning, made everyone question themselves. They were playing with cards, but he was playing with minds. He hadn't just won the table. Now, he was controlling the game. While the others tried to adjust to the new dynamics and behavior patterns of the car washer, he was already a step ahead, observing what they couldn't. See, each new hand he won wasn't just a victory in chips. It was a victory in psychology and observation. The intensity of the game grew, and with it, the discoveries. The veterans were realizing that they had underestimated the man in front of them. But more than that, they were starting to understand that the true art of poker wasn't about the cards. It was about controlling the environment, the emotions, and the minds of the opponents. The car washer, without intending to, was teaching them a lesson none of them had expected to learn. Now, the veterans were starting to wonder if, in reality, the true game wasn't about playing the cards right, but about who was playing the minds around the table. They were beginning to realize that the game was slipping out of their control, and that the car washer had become the true master of the night. The game, which had once seemed like just a fun pastime among friends, had now turned into something much more serious and complex. The car washer, who had been dismissed and underestimated, was now starting to gain the respect, and at the same time the distrust, of everyone around the table. He had already won several hands, and with each victory, the silence in the room grew. The chips in front of him were silent evidence of his mastery. But what really made him stand out wasn't his cards, but the way he controlled the game. His calm and impassive behavior, combined with his seemingly inexplicable victories, was unsettling the poker veterans. They didn't know what was happening, but something was at stake that went beyond skill with the cards. Something deeper and psychological was unfolding, and it was deeply troubling to the experienced players. As the veterans exchanged wary glances, the car washer remained unfazed. His movements were calculated, his bets well thought out. He didn't care about the disdain or the laughs that once surrounded him. Instead, he was now becoming the center of attention in a way no one had anticipated. The veterans began to question whether he was playing fairly. How could someone with so little experience be winning hand after hand? The simple idea that the rookie could be so skilled began to stir a quiet unease, a doubt that spread among the more experienced players. The car washer's victories were as unexpected as they were perplexing. The first attempts at investigation began. During a break in the game, one of the older players, known for his talent in bluffing and his sharp wit, approached the car washer. "So, you've really never played before? Because this is impressive. For someone so simple," he said, trying to mask his surprise with a nervous laugh. The car washer, as always, showed no emotion. He simply looked at him silently and gave a slight smile. "I've played, but only to learn," was his response, leaving the veteran even more confused. He realized that the answers the car washer gave weren't ordinary answers, nor easy to decipher. There was something more in those words, something he couldn't immediately grasp. Frustration began to take over his adversaries, but they didn't know what to do about it. The other players, noticing the interaction, began to speculate in silence. Each tried to understand what was happening, trying somehow to decode the car washer's secret. One of the veterans, more daring, decided to try something more direct. He approached another player and, in a whisper, said, "Isn't it strange that this guy with so little experience is winning so much? It's like he knows something we don't." The other player nodded, but was also hesitant to make any premature accusations. "I don't know. He's too calm. It's like he's not even feeling the pressure," he said. The car washer, who was sitting a little farther away, overheard part of the conversation, but didn't react. His focus was solely on the game, and he knew that the more the others spoke among themselves, the more they'd get lost in their own doubts. The atmosphere around the table was changing. The disdain that had once existed began to transform into a growing concern. The veterans gathered in small groups during breaks, discussing what was happening, trying to understand what he was doing differently. Some began to question whether the car washer was just bluffing, if he was simply playing with luck. But the truth was, while the other players had their doubts, no one could explain how he was staying so calm and consistent. It wasn't just luck. The way he observed the others, how he kept his posture and expressions unshaken, was creating an increasing tension, a tension that had no immediate explanation. The suspicions began to turn into a parallel game, a game of mutual distrust as the game continued and more chips piled up in front of him. The veterans began to worry that the car washer wasn't just playing his cards. He was manipulating the psychological game masterfully. For him, poker wasn't about bluffing or worrying about the cards. He knew the real secret was in reading others, in the emotions being played at the table. He knew the veterans were so focused on the chips and moves that they weren't seeing what he was doing. He was manipulating the environment, the emotions of the other players. He was controlling the tension, the discomfort, the insecurity. Every move he made wasn't just a play in the poker game, it was a play on the emotions of the others. What the other players were starting to realize was that the car washer wasn't just seeing the cards. He was seeing the people. He knew how to read the players, how to identify the weaknesses, the moments of doubt, of uncertainty. He knew that poker wasn't just about cards, it was about people. He wasn't winning by chance. He was dominating the mental game, controlling the reactions and emotions of everyone around him. That was what the other players couldn't understand, and as the victories kept stacking up, the discomfort only grew. They were becoming increasingly aware that they weren't playing a card game anymore. They were playing a mental game, where the car washer, unknowingly, was becoming the master. Finally, the unease reached a critical point. The more experienced players began to ask more direct questions, trying to force the car washer to reveal something. "You really never played in a casino before?" one of them asked. "Because someone with your skill isn't common among rookies." The car washer, as always, answered calmly, "Yes, I've played, but I prefer to observe before making any moves." It was a simple answer, but one that cast another shadow of doubt on what he truly knew. Now, the suspicions weren't about what he was doing, but where he came from and how he had acquired so much skill without being a professional. He wasn't just in a poker game, he was in a battle for his opponent's trust, and little by little, he was gaining not just respect, but fear. The tension at the table intensified even further, and the veterans, who had once been confident that the game would end with their victory, began to see their assumptions crumble. The car washer, with his calm and strategic posture, had thrown down the biggest challenge. He forced them to look inside themselves and question their own abilities. The game was more alive than ever, but the real mystery still remained. What exactly was behind all these victories? As the tension at the table increased and the car washer's number of victories continued to grow, the atmosphere around the table completely changed. The game was no longer a competition between experienced players and a rookie, but a psychological battle between strategically sharp minds. The veterans, who had once been confident in their superiority, began to feel uncomfortable, their eyes sharp, but increasingly uncertain. The car washer, showing no emotion or apprehension, continued to dominate the plays, as if he was simply waiting for the right moment to make the final move. But what was most impressive wasn't his victories, but how he was able to unsettle everyone around him, manipulating the emotions of others with a skill no one there seemed to understand. Finally, The direct confrontation everyone feared arrived. One of the veterans, visibly frustrated by the car washer's winning streak, decided to confront him. He could no longer ignore the growing discomfort the car washer was creating, not just with his victories, but with his unshakable calm. "How are you doing this? How is it possible that you, with so little experience, are winning every hand?" he asked, trying to keep his composure, but his tone revealed increasing anxiety. The table fell silent, and all the players focused on what would happen next. This was the moment of truth. If the car washer had any explanation for his victories, he would need to share it now, or everything would remain even more mysterious and unsettling. With his gaze fixed on the cards, the car washer finally raised his eyes to the veteran who had challenged him. There was no anger or frustration on his face. There was only a calm smile, almost as if he already knew the answer. "To the question, I just observe," he responded calmly. The words floated across the table, provoking an even deeper silence. What was he trying to say? "You think poker is just about the cards? The secret isn't in them, it's in the people you play with," he said almost philosophically, before turning his attention back to his cards. The veteran, who had a faint, cynical smile on his face, stopped abruptly. The car washer's words resonated in his mind, and something began to make sense, but he couldn't quite figure out what. It was a simple response, but full of complexity. The room was now full of uncertainties. The answers to the game's mysteries were right before them, but most still couldn't understand them. With the silence increasing as the game went on, the other players began to question themselves. They had underestimated the car washer, thinking his win was just a streak of luck. But now, with his simple and meaningful answer, it became clear that he wasn't just playing the cards. He was playing the minds of everyone around the table. He wasn't there to impress anyone with his card skills, but with his ability to read people, to study their movements, their expressions, and even their emotional flaws. For him, poker wasn't a game of luck. It was a game of emotional control. The real game was being played inside his opponents' heads. He was challenging them to deal with what they feared the most, the loss of control. As the bets piled up, the other players began to look visibly uncomfortable. The veteran who had confronted him earlier now looked at him with a mix of respect and distrust. He was no longer sure who the rookie was at that table. The car washer was challenging not just the expectations of his skills, but the very idea of how poker should be played. He didn't let the pressure of the game or the reactions of the other players affect him. He seemed to be in complete harmony with the game, as if he knew, in the end, it didn't matter what cards he had. What mattered was the reactions and the control he had over the others. And it was at this moment that the car washer's true secret was revealed. He wasn't just watching the cards, he was watching the people. He knew how to read his opponents, how to interpret the small signals, the subtle changes in body language, the involuntary reactions. He had become a master at understanding what was behind every move, what was hidden in the expressions of the other players. He didn't need many words because his gaze did all the work. It was a skill he had developed over the years, not by playing poker, but by observing people while he worked. As a car washer, he was constantly in contact with people's emotions, the reactions they had when they saw their cars being cleaned, when they were satisfied or frustrated with the result. He learned to understand the nuances of human emotions in a way few could perceive. And this skill, so simple and natural to him, was giving him the advantage in a game that required absolute emotional control. Now the veterans were starting to understand what was happening, but it was too late. They had been defeated not by the cards, but by the car washer's mind. He wasn't just a player at a poker table. He was a master of psychology, and his opponents were not prepared for that. They had focused so much on the physical aspect of the game, the cards and the bets, that they never realized the real challenge was in the minds, not the hands. The car washer was showing them that poker, at its core, is much more than a card game. It's a game of reading, perception, and psychology. And in a way, the veterans were starting to realize this now, when there was no longer a chance to turn the situation around. The game continued, but the dynamic had completely changed. The veterans, who had once been so confident in their abilities, were now wondering how they had been defeated by someone so simple, so far removed from the world they knew. The car washer, without even trying, had become a legend at that table. He wasn't just the winner of the night. He was someone who had challenged the very concept of what it meant to be good at poker. He had shown that, in the end, what matters isn't the cards, but the mind of the player. The room was silent, but the thoughts of the veterans were racing. They were starting to see the game from a new perspective, one they had never considered before. They were learning, but at a high cost. The car washer had given them all a valuable lesson, one they would never forget. For him, poker wasn't just about winning with the cards, but about winning with the mind. And in doing so, he hadn't just defeated the other players. He had also defeated the expectations everyone had of him. The turning point that everyone had anticipated but never imagined would unfold the way it did was about to happen. The tension in the room had reached its peak. The game, which had once seemed like a contest of skill, luck, and psychology, was now turning into a battle of pure emotional endurance. The veterans were exhausted, both physically and mentally. With every new hand, the stakes got higher. The laughter had given way to uneasy silence, and every move the car washer made seemed like another strategic maneuver to unsettle his opponents. They already knew he wasn't there by chance, that his victories weren't the result of luck. But this only made the battle more intense, as they now knew they were facing someone who had beaten them in the hands, but also in the mental game. It was almost like a psychological war, where no one knew who was truly in control. The veterans were facing an opponent who not only challenged their skills, but also everything they believed about poker and competition. They were starting to realize that, throughout the night, they weren't just playing cards. They were being played by the emotions and strategies of the car washer. Then, the final hand was dealt. The big, decisive hand. The car washer, as always, remained calm, his eyes fixed on the cards and the reactions of the others. He already knew what he would do. He had read the game and his opponents as well as any professional poker player, but something deeper was at stake now. His own ability to withstand the pressure and maintain emotional control. He knew his opponents were on the verge of collapse. Each of them had been touched in some way by his victories, and at the same time, by his ability to manipulate emotions. The most experienced veteran at the table, the one who seemed the most invulnerable, was sweating, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He, who had once seemed the most confident, now looked vulnerable. And the car washer knew this. He knew he was the weak point at the table. But what he didn't know was that this could be his greatest challenge. It was time to finally face the most skilled and experienced veteran at the table, in a move that would define the winner of the night. It was a risky play, one that could either break everything or secure his final victory. The veteran, with years of experience and a sharp skill set, was not easy to defeat. The table was saturated with tension, and every player knew that the moment to make a decision had arrived. No one was in a position to fool around anymore. They were all feeling their hearts pounding, sweating with every move they made. The veteran looked at the cards, and his eyes, once confident, were now deeply focused. He knew this hand could be the last. The car washer, however, had an unshakable calm. There was no hesitation in his gaze. He already knew how this story would end. The tension wasn't just in the cards, but in the emotional space between the players. Each of them was trying to read the other, trying to figure out where the bluff was, where the truth was. And as everyone watched, the car washer made the first move, a risky bet that made the other players hesitate. The veteran, who believed himself invincible, looked at him with disbelief. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just poker. It was a test of character, a test of mental endurance. The bet was made. The veteran didn't hesitate for long. He too remained calm, but something in his eyes betrayed that he was uncertain. He was asking himself, what does he know that I don't? What the car washer had that the veteran didn't was an extraordinary emotional control. He knew poker wasn't just about the hands. It was about the people. He knew he was dealing with the weaknesses of others, and that was his greatest advantage. The veterans were becoming increasingly visibly agitated. They were starting to question themselves, to doubt their own strategy. The most experienced veteran, who had once seemed to be in total control, now started to get nervous. And, as if it were a sign that the game was truly changing, the car washer made the final move. He raised the bet. It was a risky, bold, but calculated move. He was no longer playing with the cards. He was playing with the emotions of his adversaries. And this, once again, put the veteran on the edge of making a decision. The veteran looked at him, fixing his eyes for a long moment, before finally speaking. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" The car washer didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was more eloquent than any words. Finally, the veteran made the move everyone had been expecting, but his decision was the same one the car washer had predicted. He reluctantly decided to call the bet. The tension reached its peak. The final card would be revealed. The chips were stacked in front of him. But more important than that, the decision he made now wouldn't be about the cards. He was playing against the car washer's mind, against his unshakable calm, against the confidence the rookie had shown throughout the night. The veteran, who had considered the car washer just a distraction, now saw he was playing against someone who had a much deeper skill than he had ever imagined. When the final cards were turned over, the room fell into absolute silence. The car washer won. Not because he had the best hand, but because he had dominated his opponent's mind. The victory wasn't in the cards, but in the ability to maintain emotional control and understand the psychological game. He had played his opponent's emotions, manipulating their fear and insecurity to the very last second. The veteran, though defeated, couldn't help but feel a twinge of respect. He knew he had been beaten, but the way the car washer played, the way he challenged them, made him feel like he had been defeated by more than just a rookie. It was the mental control, the mastery of human psychology, that really made the difference. The car washer, without saying a word, turned to the other players and looked at them with a slight smile. He didn't need to say anything. His victory was in his actions, and now everyone knew that. In this game, he was the master. The table was silent, but the lesson was clear. The car washer hadn't won by chance. He had won because he knew poker wasn't just about cards. It was about understanding people. He had given a lesson that everyone, especially the veteran, would never forget. He wasn't just a car washer. He was that night a master of the mind, a strategist of the psychological, someone who had played a much deeper and more complex game than anyone at the table had imagined. The game was finally coming to an end, and the poker room, once filled with tension and distrust, now seemed to be in an almost reverent silence. The car washer, with his calm and unshakable demeanor, had not only won the last hand, but also gained something far more valuable than chips: respect. He was no longer the overlooked rookie. He was a winner, and his victory was not simple. He had clearly and undeniably shown that true skill in poker was not in the cards or the bets. It was in the mind. It was in the ability to understand human emotions, to manipulate the psychology of the game so effectively that it became impossible for the other players not to notice. Justice was served not just through his accumulated victories, but by the fact that the car washer had defied all the expectations placed upon him. That night wasn't just about poker. It was about proving that anyone, regardless of their background or profession, could overcome the barriers society imposes. The veterans, who had initially laughed at him and underestimated him, now found themselves facing something they had never considered. His defeat wasn't due to his lack of skill with the cards, but to his lack of understanding about the mental and emotional game. They started to realize that, at some point, they had allowed their egos to consume them, the need to control the chips and bets, but had never realized that true control lay in the emotions. The car washer hadn't won by chance. He wasn't just there to play. He was there to teach a lesson, to show that the true power in poker wasn't in being the best at playing cards, but in being able to play with the minds of others, manipulating every thought, every move, every reaction they made around him. And that was the great victory. For him, justice wasn't in defeating the other players, but in showing them that the real master wasn't the one who knew the rules best, but the one who knew how to dominate the hearts and minds of others. However, the impact of the victory was even deeper. The car washer wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He hadn't become the center of attention out of vanity, but because he wanted in some way to prove something to himself. He wanted to see how far his mind could go, how far he could go, even when he was underestimated, ignored. When he left the poker table, there was no air of arrogant triumph. He had played his game, and although he knew his success wasn't just by chance, he didn't want others to think his victory came from his cards or the game itself. He wanted them to understand that he was more than the work he did, more than the title the world placed upon him. His victory was the greatest form of justice, because he had won the only battle that really mattered, the battle against the assumptions others made about him. When the last veteran stood up from the table, he looked at the car washer with a look of respect, something the car washer never could have expected that night. He knew he was no longer seen as the amateur that no one cared about. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The victory had been earned in the most unexpected way, but also in the fairest way, because in the end, the greatest injustice of all was the one he faced when he walked into that room. The assumption that he didn't belong there, that someone like him could never win. And that injustice was righted not by the strength of his hand, but by the strength of his mind and observation. He had been underestimated, but his greatest revenge and his greatest victory was showing that he was playing a different game from everyone else. The veterans, as they got up and started leaving the room, were no longer laughing, nor exchanging cynical smiles. They were silent, absorbing the magnitude of the lesson they had just received. They knew they hadn't just lost a game of poker. They had lost to something greater. They had lost to a skill they had never considered. The ability to read human behavior, to notice the small shifts in expressions and movements, to adapt not just to the cards, but to the psychology of others. The car washer had won, because he knew that poker, in fact, wasn't a game of cards. It was a game of people, and he knew exactly how to play it. When the room finally emptied and the last chip was counted, the car washer stayed there for a few more minutes. He wasn't celebrating, but reflecting on everything that had happened. He had proved to everyone, including himself, that expectations and prejudices couldn't determine his worth. His victory wasn't just about winning chips. It was about gaining the respect that no one had believed he would have until that night. He had shown that true power wasn't in the cards, but in the ability to manipulate the hearts and minds of the people around him. He had given a lesson, not just to the other players, but to everyone who saw him as someone inferior, as someone who didn't deserve to be there. As he left the room, he felt a sense of relief, not because he had won, but because he had gained something deeper. He had proven to himself that anyone, regardless of their background or profession, could be more than the world expected. He didn't need to be a professional poker player. He just needed to be himself, with his sharp mind and his ability to understand people. And that, without a doubt, was the true victory. He knew that justice had been served, and that his lesson had been learned not just by others, but by himself. He was no longer just a car washer. He was a winner, and that was all that really mattered. With the victory finally secured, the car washer left the room, the weight of the night on his shoulders, but with a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in years. The pressure of the bets, the tension of the game, and especially the disdain from the other players were all gone. But the feeling that remained wasn't one of arrogance or pride. No, his feeling was deeper, and in a way, more human. He felt a kind of relief, a sense of personal achievement that couldn't be measured simply in chips or poker victories. He had proven to himself, more than anyone else there, that true strength wasn't in what he did or in the profession he had, but in his ability to stay in control, to withstand pressure, to never be shaken by the expectations the world imposed on him. He had won, but not by the game itself. He had won by seeing beyond it, by understanding that the real game wasn't in the cards, but in the minds and hearts of those around him. For the car washer, poker had always been a metaphor for life. The bets he made that night weren't just about chips. He was betting his own dignity, his identity, his vision of himself. Up until that point, he had been consistently underestimated, ignored, treated as inferior. But at that table, he showed something he didn't even know he was capable of. The true strength is in resistance, in knowing that even when the world tries to bring you down, you can stay strong, believe in yourself, and eventually teach others a great lesson. He didn't win for pride or the need to prove something to anyone. He won because he knew, above all, he needed to earn his own respect. As he left the room, he allowed himself a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it carried a quiet sense of satisfaction. He wasn't celebrating the victory, but rather the transformation that night had given him. He remembered the beginning of the night, how he had sat there, ridiculed and disbelieved. He had entered that room not knowing what to expect, but now, he was leaving as someone who had challenged his own limitations. He knew his journey didn't end there, but something inside him had changed. He was no longer in that submissive position, the one who simply accepted the role the world had given him. He had something more now. Confidence. Looking back at the now silent poker room, the car washer reflected on everything that had happened. He understood that, in his life, he had always been placed in the background. People saw his work and judged it as a reflection of his identity, as if washing cars was all he could be. But what he discovered that night was that the true essence of a person isn't in what they do, but in what they can overcome. He no longer saw himself as the car washer that no one took seriously. He saw himself as someone who had won not just at poker, but at life. He now knew that anyone, in any circumstance, could surprise others. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson he could carry for the rest of his life. As he walked toward the exit, with the chips he had won tightly in his hand, he felt that there was something more important than the chips. He had proven to himself that it wasn't the title given to him that defined him, but the courage to believe in himself, to rise above the expectations and limitations imposed by society. He knew that the real victory was over himself. He had faced life's adversities, the disdainful looks, and had come out on top. Poker was just the setting where this happened, but the real game, the most important one, was inside him, in his mind, in his ability to keep going, to learn, to grow. As he entered the taxi that would take him home, the car washer looked out the window, watching the city slowly pass by. A gentle sense of peace began to settle inside him. He had done what many thought was impossible. He had proven himself worthy, not by others' recognition, but by his own understanding of who he was. He didn't need anyone else's validation. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had earned something that couldn't be taken from him. Poker wasn't just a card game, and that night wasn't just about chips. It was about learning how to deal with life, with challenges, with one's own fears. And in the end, the car washer knew that his greatest victory wasn't in the hands he played, but in the way he played the greatest game of all, the game of life. The city continued to move around him, but inside, the car washer knew that something profound had changed. He didn't need to be anything more than who he was. And with that thought, he smiled, knowing that the true victories, the ones that really matter, are never the most visible. They are the ones that happen within us, in the choices we make, the battles we face, and ultimately the lessons we learn. Now he was more than the world expected of him. He was the winner, not because he had won at poker, but because he had won over himself.